And I mean, that's not really much of a mechanic. It does help ground things and sanction things, and it helps with a lot of things. Rolling a die is sort of like sanctioning the idea that it could either succeed or fail. And now the player's expectation is that both of those possibilities are on the table. And so the idea of merely rolling a die actually does have interesting and important gameplay elements to it. But ultimately, there's not much to it. The way usually I run it is, if you make a reasonable argument, you can make a persuasion check. If you don't want to make an argument, you can't think of why they would care, then you can't make a persuasion check. And that's sort of the gameplay of it. And the more effort you spend trying to convince someone, the less the check matters, right? The less weighted the random element is, because you're putting a lot of effort into it. And that's how I sort of reward players for keeping things rolling. In fact, I have an interesting story. I have an interesting story about a game that I ran just last week. My players have been largely fighting everything, which they're actually quite story-focused players, but they have been very much fighting everything. Now, in fairness, there's a lot of things that are just being very aggressive toward them. There's not a lot of opportunity to be like, this was about to be a fight. Do you want it to be a fight? This wasn't the first time that's been an opportunity, but it is one of the few times it's been an opportunity thus far. And they, for the first time, decided to actively pursue a non-combat solution in what is otherwise a very hostile circumstance. It's not the first time they've pursued any non-combat solution in any situation. It's the first time they've pursued a non-combat solution in a hostile environment. And I was not prepared at all for that, because it was the first time it's happened. I was not ready for it. I was just like, here's the fight, it's going to happen, because that's how it always happens. But then it started to be a social encounter, and I recognized, and this is the important thing, I recognized in that moment, if I don't reward this behavior, I'm effectively communicating, hey, don't do this. Because it's the first time they've ever really done it, and there's a conversation happening here, right? There's subtext to this where they start going, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk to the person who's actively threatening to kill us. It was unambiguous. The villain in this circumstance was like, hey, I'm going to kill you now. And the party was like, whoa, let's talk this out, which was weird. They've never really done that before. So I recognized, because I have been DMing for a while now, and I know how this goes, and it's a game design problem, right? This is player behavior and player decisions, and do I want to reward it or not? Because if I reward it, I can increase the likelihood that behavior continues or recurs. And if I don't reward it, and this is important, because if I don't reward it, if I just don't reward it, not if I punish them, just if I don't reward it, the behavior almost certainly dies. So what I did was I made the conversation kind of like, hey, you don't know whether this is working yet. And the first check I made the party make was not a persuasion check. Because the problem with a persuasion check in that situation is it implies the possibility of failure. And I was not prepared yet to imply the possibility of failure, because I had not yet implied the possibility of success. Now, a die kind of does both, but I had the party make an insight check first. An insight check because it's low stakes. An insight check is nice in this situation because it's not a persuasion check. It doesn't represent the ultimate success or failure of this attempt. It represents, can I give you more information that you might glean from this person? And that was really interesting, because it turned out the roll was pretty good. So I started giving them more information, like, she might be receptive, right? Even though you're basically trying to sway her totally away from her whole way of life, she's thinking like, you know, maybe there's a glimmer of hope. Maybe that there's a glimmer of hope. And then after another few minutes of talking, then I allowed a persuasion check. After really clearly establishing that, like, yes, this could be a thing. Now, that was important, because if that persuasion check had failed, if the persuasion check fails, what happens is the player doesn't get anything they were actively working for, and the reason they don't get the thing they were actively working for is because they rolled low on a die. Sometimes that's a very reasonable thing to allow, that the player fails because the die just wasn't in their favor. Sometimes that's totally valid. But often it isn't. And often it isn't, because if the player is investing a lot into that, and then ultimately it comes down to the roll of a die, why would your player continue to invest into it, right? Because think about it this way. Players will, given enough time, players tend toward the path of least resistance. Given enough time, players tend toward a path of least resistance. I've used the analogy of like a running stream before, where players are like a running stream. They'll kind of take the path of least resistance and they'll just go, they kind of go along with it. At the time, it was players will always attempt to alleviate tension. It's like a force of nature. And that's true. And it works in the same sense when I say players will take the path of least resistance. In fact, they're very closely connected. And that means that over time, things that aren't rewarded will tend to fall away. They will tend to fall away. So if I hadn't properly set up that die roll, if I hadn't properly set it up, I would have created a scenario where the player would have felt as though the time was being invested and then wasted. Because if it comes down to the roll of a d20, even if I give you advantage or something, if it ultimately comes down to luck, you're not going to expend that much effort before, right? If I give you advantage, then it's going to be how much are you willing to do in order to get advantage? Now, different players might be willing to do more or less. That's true. But the question that I'm raising in that player's mind, subconsciously or otherwise, probably subconsciously, but maybe not, is still the same. No matter who the player is, what I'm communicating is still, hey, you have to figure out how much it's worth to you to get advantage. And then the player has to decide. So if the player does this whole like, so imagine you have a situation where a player does like two hours of effort taking all of the things that you've been giving them and putting together this intricate plan that's everything's going to work out great because, oh my God, I've accounted for every contingency. But you made some element of that plan come down to like, well, okay, roll a thing, right? This part of the plan hinges on the persuasion check. So make your persuasion check. Even if the check is good, you still heavily risk the player being like, well, why would I do all that? Like, I'm not going to invest 2 hours of my time putting together a plan if the success of that plan comes down to a persuasion check, because I can get the same result by going up to the guy and saying, hey, can I do this thing? Right? And then just making one reasonable argument. I can take 5 minutes and figure that out and do that. Or I can spend 2 hours putting everything together. So you need to be very, very careful about when you're utilizing dice and what you're communicating and how you're communicating that, because it takes one slip up on your part as a DM. If you slip up once, that player is done. And I don't mean the player is done with your game. I mean the player is never going to engage to that extent again, ever. And I recognize that in that moment, when during this conversation, I recognized that this was one of those moments. This was one of those moments. Now, they weren't investing a lot, so that gave me a little more leeway. I didn't need them to succeed because they hadn't invested a lot. But I did the insight check first because I wanted to give them more information, and I wanted them to be thinking that there was more information, that there was more going on than maybe they were fully privy to. And that's helpful because even if the check is low, it still suggests that there's more information. And now the decisions are going to change based on the fact that there might be more information. Then later when I do the persuasion check, first of all, if they've responded to what I've told them via the insight check, assuming the insight check is reasonably high, then I can start to sort of assess whether the player has done enough to warrant removing some element of the luck. And maybe at first it's advantage. At first it's maybe a persuasion check when a persuasion check is otherwise totally unlikely, right? If it starts with, hey, I'm gonna kill you right now, like I'm gonna kill you immediately, and it ends with, okay, you can make a persuasion check for them to not kill you, that's a big win. And you can hopefully see by setting all that up, it feels like a big win to just get out of there without having to do the fight. As opposed to, if I had given them a persuasion check really early on, and then let them leave as a result of that, what that signifies is, hey, whether or not this is a fight really just comes down to how high you roll on a d20. And then the player isn't actively incentivized to do interesting things, right? So you can, even if you're a totally story-focused DM, it's actually really easy. If you're not thinking about the game design element of D&D, it's really easy to accidentally de-incentivize story-driven behavior. So you have to be really very careful, and it's a great example. It's a phenomenal example of why game design is the right approach, and why thinking about D&D as a game first is the most successful mindset shift, if you're not already doing it, or habit if you already are, that you can possibly have. Because even if your goal is story, you kind of have to break down what that means, right? Because for me, in that moment, engaging with the story meant caring about who the NPC is, caring about what her background is, caring about what her motivations are, caring about what the circumstance is. And it helps that they were faced with probably a pretty terrifying fight. Like, it was implied that whatever was happening, they were ready for the players, and the players were going to have a real hell of a time getting out of it. So hopefully that gives you some insight. And I mean, this was really pretty rambly. But you know what? It's fun. It was a fun time. I just had some thoughts, kind of wanted to get them out there. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cut out all of the first part of the video. Now, for those of you who are watching up to this point, you don't know what the first part of the video was because I cut it out. It was a description of two common house rules, crit damage and flanking, and why I don't think they're good house rules to use. That may still be a video, but honestly, it's another one of those situations where the subject matter frustrates me a little bit. I think I come off a little harsh because that's kind of what happens. It's like, oh, this stuff. Oh God, don't make me do this. Please stop using those house rules kind of thing, which is not really what I'm going for. I'll probably revisit them when I've calmed down a little bit, but I'll probably put in this story about the thing, and that'll be the video. So hopefully the story is helpful. The subject matter is why thinking about D&D like a game is the way to go. All right. That was it for me. I think you can probably look forward to me doing videos like this. Not necessarily regularly, pretty much just whenever the mood strikes me. Also, for those of you still sticking with me for some reason, I think the channel is probably going to move in a more design-oriented direction. I mean, it's already a very design-oriented channel, but because it's the GDA channel, I'm going to be moving some of the mainline content over into a less D&D-centric creating a less D&D-centric vision for it. And there'll probably be some more video game stuff. There'll probably be some responses to common design videos. I'm planning either a video or a couple videos on why you shouldn't be looking at Game Maker's Toolkit, Mark Brown, as game design advice or game design education. It's very interesting as a way of gaining maybe some appreciation for game development and game design, but it's not great advice for a developer or for an aspiring designer. I don't think that's its intent, but I have seen it used that way, and I would like to explain why it's not a good idea to use it that way so that people aren't misled. Not that I think that that's Mark Brown's intent by any stretch, but you can look forward to some more sort of mainline design content. There will be some video game stuff, and I'll continue to do D&D stuff like this for sure, and then some more structured stuff as I can, like as the structured things kind of fall into place and I have something really good to give you that's highly structured, I'll do that. You know, like the Combat Curve series is, I know, sort of the main thing that people like about the channel, but the Combat Curves series is a very tightly constructed game design framework that took like a while to put together, right? That's not something that I can put together in a weekend. For example, the core tension framing that I've been using on occasion, that you've probably heard, is and this is probably fairly apparent, it's fairly loose. It's kind of nebulous still. I'm still tweaking it. I'm still working on it. I'm still trying to put it into something that's going to eventually be a really nice tight framework. But it's not there yet. It takes time. And in the meantime, I'm just going to keep working on that. So thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to my rambling. My voice is starting to get scratchy because I've been talking for a while. This is not the first thing I've done today. But I I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something useful out of it. More importantly, I hope you got something useful out of it, really. If you have similar stories, also, as always, if you have questions, comments, etc., feel free to leave them. I may do another like DM Academy thing, but I'd much rather answer your questions if you have any than try to have to ping random questions off of Reddit. So please feel free to do that, and I will see you when I see you. Goodbye, my void. You're my void.